Well, good evening, everyone. Good evening, and welcome to Thursday at West Shore. Most of you I know, I'm Barbara Walker, candidate for Commissioned Lay Minister here at our church. We created Thursdays at West Shore to be a program to bring spirituality into our week, so it's not just on Sundays. We wanted to provide an intergenerational format that is inclusive of all, whatever form of our faith we choose to practice. So we dabble in all kinds of different stuff at these. Whatever challenges that have faced us during the past 19 months, during COVID, personally, and as a congregation, I am just so grateful that we are blessed to be together here again. I get all teared up when I'm up here. I appreciate us taking whatever baby steps we need so that we get opportunities like this to be together. So tonight, although we are small in number, this begins to give me faith and a little bit of hope. So let me take a moment to thank a few of the people who helped make tonight happen. And I'll start with Tommy's Pastries. They provided us trays of Hungarian pastries. They're supposed to be the best in the area. The owner is from the region of Transylvania that we have our partner church. And if you enjoy them, please contribute to the free will offering basket out there, which will help support Thursdays at West Shore and the programming we bring. We usually have a community meal, so it helps pay for that as well. And a quick thank you to my husband for being the person who always picks up the food. Also our staff, Debbie Elliott, Shay Bolger, Christine Salante, Megan Ross, Diane Alcorn, our tech folks. I can't say your names enough to make people aware of the behind-the-scenes stuff that makes these programs work. Many of you have begun by sharing your stories, and our storytellers, who I thank for encouraging me to go to Transylvania, have my own spiritual experience. And lastly, I cannot go without thanking Sil. Sil is much the reason we have this amazingly strong relationship with our partner church. And that is why I begin to call it not just our partner church, but this is our partner village. It is a sparkle in her eyes when she talks about this place, that when she asked me on a cold day back in March, in a pandemic, when we were watching a film festival movie distanced in my living room, "Oh yeah, I'm going to Transylvania in July or August. You want to go?" I absolutely had to say yes. Honestly, in the middle of COVID, I had no idea or hope that this would actually happen, but it did. Reverend Anthony and Rachel and Sil and I, the intrepid travelers, embarked. The journey different for all of us, and yet bonded by the experience in a way that echoed our history in this beloved village and its residents. So tonight, you will hear the stories all the way back to the 1990s, of West Shore members who were adventurous, brave, and willing to let travel and a pilgrimage change them. So let us now light our chalice. We light our chalice now to pay honor to our long-standing friendships with our partner church, the friendships and community that it has built among us. May this flame carry us as we strengthen and continue this relationship that builds us from our roots to our wings. I'm going to lead you now in a little bit of a guided meditation. Every day, I would walk the path from Reverend Bela's house to my house family and back again several times, always with an eye to the steeple. And it became a walking meditation for me. So as we settle in tonight, let's take a few deep breaths. 1, in and out. And in and out. And in and out. Imagine you are entering the village of Baygon by dirt road after a long journey, this part on foot. You are weary, but content, excited for the journey ahead. The rocks under your feet remind you of why you were warned to bring good shoes. You are greeted by the villagers, warm, gracious. Their hospitality and hugs, even in a pandemic. They are so grateful the Americans have come back. More food than you can ever imagine. Homemade bread, peaches, plums, fresh meats, and cheeses. Homemade wine and palinka appear almost out of nowhere. You quickly begin to ease into this welcoming part of the community. The language barrier eased by the shared commonality of laughter. And then, darkness has long fallen on the summer evening when you walk the path back to your host family. Glance up at the crescent moon and back at the church, the lit steeple. Settle in for your first night's sleep on the journey and anticipate the adventures to come. This is a small taste of what I experienced. Honestly, in complete full disclosure, as life so happens to go on when you travel back home, life doesn't stop. And on one of the first evenings that I was there, I learned that one of my best friends back home was in the ICU, and then eventually that he was in hospice. And he died before I got to return home. So many of these walks were spent bargaining with the clouds, the spirits, and some kind of God, to at least let him live long enough to say goodbye. And amazingly, in a text message to his wife, across the miles, we were able to silently convey that. And I felt his presence on this trip, and I also believe he felt mine. The empathy that I discovered within this village and my new friends held me and held my heart through this experience. I learned that in the small villages, when someone dies, the church bells ring. The bells had rung one of the evenings I was there, and my host family said, "Who died?" And then she told me the story of the bells, and that it is even a different tone when a man dies. It's a lower tone, and then higher for a woman. And the bell is in the picture, and I did take a video of the ringing bell to remind me, because while we were there, Bela had to go do a funeral, then a woman had died. But the whole village knew it by the bell. So now I'd like to invite Syl up, and she's going to share with you some of our West Shore history with our partner church, as well as some of her personal and spiritual impact that this community has had on her in the past 20 plus years.
Good evening. So I'll begin with some of the history. For those of you who remember John Molnar, who was Hungarian ethnicity, grew up in Slavic Village over in the Buckeye area. He actually adopted the name John Karpati Molnar for the Carpathian Mountains. He paid a get-acquainted visit to the Unitarian Church in Budapest in 1990, and that was actually the historic structure where Bela Bartok, the composer and Unitarian, was the organist. And that really is how we date the beginning of our partner church relationship. Letters were exchanged, and this was even before the UU Service Committee had started with the partner church programs over there. When we had learned of the needs of the Unitarian refugees under the terrible Ceausescu regime, we contributed some funds to help with their medical costs, resettlement, and joined then with the Service Committee in 1993 to help establish the partner church program. So then in '92, a group from West Shore took another tour, and this time did visit Transylvania and visited Kolozsvár and Cluj. We hadn't been assigned Baygon yet. And those people were John Molnar, Erica Pillacy, Barbara Howell, Jim Hamilton, and Scott Princer was the intern minister who was heavily involved with that. So that was the year we adopted our second partner church with Baygon, and then things just continued by letter and email after that. It took a big turn in 2001 when we had GA here in Cleveland, and that was when Bela came and Polly came. They were newlyweds, and they stayed with us, they stayed with Erica, they stayed with different people around in the congregation on the committee. But what really started it was that Gary asked Bela if he liked to fish, and Bela loves to fish, and Gary, my late husband, loved to fish. So that started a friendship that was born of one of the strongest motivators, catching a fish in Lake Erie and in the Rocky River. And I also learned that Polly liked to cook, so that was it. In the following two summers, Gary and our daughter Dorothy, who was then about 14, 15, went over, and we made connections with villagers. Dorothy worked as a counselor at a summer camp nearby. And then in the following summer of '04 was when we started a summer camp. The picture in the bottom is of a young man named Attila, and actually April stayed at Attila's house. Jerry and David know them very well, and this was when Atti was 5. This is Attila now. So it's been quite a longitudinal study that we've been able to have. The following year, summer camp was so effective and useful and so unusual. I had them painting rocks. I mean, Dorothy and I did it by ourselves, and we just had them do very basic things. They had no crafts, no art, no supplies or anything. So taking over construction paper and feathers was just all that they could handle. But the following summer, David Prock, Mark, Edie Schwady, and Agnes Tina went, and we actually had started the children with putting on a summer program, camp, play at the end of the summer camp for the village, and that was just so much fun. They had to make costumes and kind of learn a script and tell the story, and we did Jonah and the Whale for that. Again, we returned the next year, 6 and 7. This time Jerry came the first time. We ended up just progressing every summer. It just got to be a thing. And early in 2008, two brothers, Barney and Zoli Varro, came to stay here, worked in the summer, and I think there's some of the people here they did some work for, if I recall. But also in 2008, during what I can only describe as Palinka-fueled discussions, Carrie and Bela hatched a plan, and it's finally now come into fruition 15 years later. And that was when we were helping as a partner church committee all that time. We could raise enough funds, thanks to the generosity of Erica and John Carpati Molnar especially, to put in a new well for the minister's church, minister's house, which is owned by the church. At one point, we helped them put in a new heating system because Bela had to wake up in the winter every hour and a half to feed the stove with firewood. And we said, this is just crazy. And then they figured out how to parlay some of the money into redoing the upstairs of the minister's house for a place for people to stay and a separate bathroom, which was not that many bathrooms in Baygon when we first went. I think there were 5, and those were the houses where we stayed. But that was when the work of the church for renovation, it needed a new roof, and it was a much more than this roof would ever cost. It needed new electricity. It just basically needed a whole renovation. And so they realized they could why not, what the heck, apply for an EU grant as a historic structure. Ends up after a few years, they actually ended up getting it. And what we paid for was the upfront engineering costs to scope out what the total cost of the projects would be. And that's how they came up with €500,000. The year after that, '09, was a big celebration the church had in September for their 400th anniversary. It actually celebrated its 200th year as the existing church structure, even though the parts of the structure were more than 900 years old. And then that was when we exchanged a plaque. Gary and I took a plaque, and they gave us a plaque, and it's somewhere in the library that you can see. Then it started getting to be, I realized it was much more of a friendship and a deep, deep relationship, because it was the following year, in 2010, that both Gary Knudsen and Mark Holloway died within 2 months of each other. And I traveled there that summer alone to take some of Gary's ashes to leave there. I thought, maybe I'll sprinkle them in the gorge, toward a gorge, or sprinkle them at the church courtyard or something. But the congregation had bigger plans. Truly, they embraced me in my grief, and I will describe one of the spiritual moments about that. They requested if they could build a spot for Gary's ashes on the church grounds, and that had already gone through the board of trustees, the lay presidents, and so forth. And I had no idea of what they had in mind, and they built it. And it was a really poignant moment to see that they called Gary one of the saints of the church. And the following year, Jerry and David came over with Mark's ashes, and we added into the monument, and Mark became a saint as well, one of the saints of the Baygon Church. Following year, in 2013, we had our first real pilgrimage with Reverends Wayne and Kathleen. A group of 13 people went. The Smiths went, April went, Dave and Jerry went. We had Kathy Little went, a few other folks, Jennifer Oxley. And Jim Hamilton went as well, and he'd been there in the 1990s, so that was kind of exciting. He could go full circle and remembered people who were there. And then in subsequent years, we watched as the number of village scholars, that was one of our programs to sponsor kids who would go to the Unitarian High School in Kolozsvár. Very competitive program to get in. It's one of the best high schools in Romania. And it's the best Hungarian high school in Romania. But they always score very highly on their tests and always place very well. But fewer kids were going, A, because it was so competitive, B, there was a Hungarian school that opened up in Torda so that they could go to a Hungarian school close by without having to leave home. Each summer, and this is something that I think Barbara will highlight, and certainly Megan will too, each summer it's a different experience. It's as different as the group of Unitarians that go. But in 2016, Bela, Poli, and Laszlo came over for Wayne and Kathleen's retirement. Laszlo is their son, who was born in '05. And that was when we learned about a big deal. We learned about there was an archaeological find of gold hair rings that clipped right here to hold on these toques that people would wear. And that was when we learned about a big deal. We learned about there was an archaeological find of gold hair rings that clipped right here to hold on these toques that people would wear. And it was part of the excavation prior to the renovation that they found with this EU money. But that just changed everything. There have only been 23 of these gold hair rings discovered in the world. And this is the only one in this region. And they were able to rewrite Hungarian history in Transylvania because of this find and a couple of other finds at our little church. In 2017, we had another pilgrimage with Reverend Tricia and a big group of 10 or so. That included Mary Jo Maish, Matt Aber, Catherine Almquist, and her granddaughter, Kichikati, and Megan Ross, along with the regulars. At this point, the church had been gutted for the renovation. We saw skeletal remains. We saw all sorts of stuff. And we could also see the footprint of what the other church structures had been. 2019, huge event. That was Laszlo's confirmation, where all the 14-year-olds had to stand and deliver for their catechetical drilling in front of the congregation. I mean, when they get confirmed, they really have to know their stuff. And at one of the many parties to celebrate, and this is one of those, you can't make this up. I came out of the house, this was at Janči's place, and I heard a rousing rendition of Take Me Home, Country Roads in Hungarian. I couldn't make that up if I had to. I thought, because my daughter went to WVU for med school, and I thought, what? And they're just wailing Country Roads in Hungarian, Take Me Home. Yeah, in West Virginia. 2020, as you know, was a wash. That was the time of COVID, and that was supposed to have been the grand reopening. But what was interesting is that a number of the people who had been migrating to Koleshvar or migrating to Torda and leaving the village came back. And Barbara will talk about that. So 2021 saw a summer of intrepid travelers, as you've heard. The grand reopening still delayed, but we stayed 2 weeks, and it was an intense immersion in everything. And now Bela has one request for us, which is to have the choir go this coming year for the grand reopening, and we're working on that diligently. David Blazer is in. He is in, and we're working on getting the choir there. But in summary, for those of us that have had this longitudinal study, I would mention as I see the Smiths, the Keishas have a new grandson, adorable. They stayed with the Keishas. In summary, we've been to the wedding of one of our first campers, who is now a nurse, has her own baby, was christened this summer. She was the one that tended to Trisha when she had the wrist injury. We've been to christenings and confirmations. We have been to funerals. And we have become friends, just good friends.
And I'd like to call Megan up. Megan's going to tell the story from Matt Aber's perspective.
So as Barbara was saying, I attended the trip to Baygon in 2018, and Matt Aber was one of the people who went along. I'll be sharing his story, and then later on the story of Mary Jo, who was my roommate at the famous Ilushka's house. Matt has a family connection to the area, and we were able to journey with him as he searched for records of his ancestors. And here's his story. He writes, "My father's immigrant ancestors were peasant farmers, small landholders that lived in rural, intensely communal agricultural villages in modern-day Romania. They were ethnic Germans, originally from the Lower Rhine region, that had migrated to Transylvania at the bequest of Hungarian kings to inhabit and develop the region while protecting the Kingdom of Hungary.
Hello,
Transylvania
I am
Saxons, as they
Laszlo
were known,
Pop,
were
the
famous for
minister
many
of your
things,
partner church
perhaps most of all
here in
for
Baygon,
churches,
Transylvania.
many of which survive today. While they lived in one of the most diverse regions of Europe, the Saxons rarely intermarried with the Hungarians, Romanians, settlers, Jews, and gypsies they lived amidst. This was in part to preserve the culture they had created from their migration, settlements, and shared history from the 1100s to the 1940s. While in Transylvania, I was able to visit the ancestral village of my great-grandfather, Michael Binder. Michael emigrated to Cleveland in 1924 from the village of Hamlish, Romania, a village established by German Saxon colonists. Most localities in this region of Romania have German, Romanian, and Hungarian names, and today it is known by its Romanian name, Amnes. We arrived as tourists, uncertain of our whereabouts, in need of a guide to a strange place nobody had visited previously, with little time to spare, as we were needed to return to the van by a certain time per our contract. So what had happened was we were all traveling to see this church that Matt's family had been a part of, and this story is the story that everybody remembers from that trip. So when we get to the village, we don't know where we're going. And the van pulls over, and the driver shouts out in Hungarian or Romanian to a young boy on the side of the road who just hops in the van with us and agrees to show us where to go and take us to the person who has the keys to the church that we wanted to visit. And it made me think, being here, there's no way if you pulled a van over on the side of the road, some kid would jump in and just give you directions and tell you where to go, but it's a thing over there. So we got the keys, and we were able to go and visit this church. So that picture that you see right there, it was when we went into this kind of crumbling old church that Matt's ancestors had belonged to, and he went inside and actually saw the name of one of his ancestors painted on the wall. He writes, "The church visit was a very moving experience. The names of so many of my ancestors were on plaques adjoining the altar, plaques with the names of villagers that had sacrificed their lives in service to their fellow Saxons during the wars we refer to as World War I and World War II. They were on the wrong side of history in these conflicts. We were able to climb the bell tower and view the village and Carpathian hills from above. It was very moving. My grandfather's name, Michael, was painted on the inside of the church on a wall near the front entrance because he and fellow Hamlischer migrants in Cleveland from Hamlisch had donated money for new church bells in the bell tower. The previous bells had been confiscated and melted down in the creation of World War I armaments. Sadly, today, there are no Saxons living in Hamlisch, and Romanians and Gypsies live in the homes they used to have. The church we visited is not in use. It was filthy, and it had fallen into disrepair. Moreover, fewer than 1% of the 500,000 Saxon-strong population that had lived in the region in 1940 are still in Transylvania. The church was a ghost Saxon church in a ghost Saxon town in a region with a sad history. If spirituality, like history, enables us to see from a greater distance new and varied perspectives to gain insight and understanding in an emotionally meaningful way, my time in Transylvania was very spiritual. I toured the Saxon city of Hermannstadt. I took a hike and picked wild mushrooms in the mountains that my ancestors picked wild mushrooms in. The mushrooms that Bela and I picked were put in a breakfast egg scramble by my host mother. I held Saxon handicrafts, including a large silver communion cup still in use by our sister church for youth confirmation ceremonies. I tasted the cuisine of the region, a cuisine that I was familiar with from my grandparents and great-grandparents here in Cleveland, but it was a different, more authentic and meaningful flavor, now in the context of our travels and the food we were served from our gracious hosts. Small signs of my family heritage seemed everywhere during the trip. My understanding of myself, who I am, and where I came from has been enhanced by visiting a place I had read so much about over the years, a process akin to placing puzzle pieces together in my mind. I am forever grateful to have had such a special trip. William James suggested that spirituality is a quest for a transformation from a state of perceived wrongness to a state of perceived rightness by making contact with some higher power or powers. The philosopher John Hicks thinks of spirituality as a transformation from a selfish and egocentric state to an unselfish and caring one. With these definitions in mind, my time in Transylvania can also be described as dispiriting, a trip with mixed emotions, a reflective and somber trip. For centuries, the Saxons alternated between periods of peaceful coexistence and threatening divisions rooted in ethnic, racial, and political antagonisms, a kind of common public enemy politics amongst groups they shared Transylvania with. After decades of Hungarian and Romanian policies intending to limit their political autonomy, language, culture, educational systems, and wealth, many Saxons saw in Adolf Hitler a man who would enhance their prospects in their native land. Many Saxons were enthusiastic Nazis during the war. As conscripts or volunteers, many Saxons served the Nazi cause in SS units. As such, the occupying Soviet army were ruthless toward the Saxons that remained in Transylvania after the war. Atrocities include rape of German women, and able-bodied individuals were sent to Siberia to work off their perceived debts, labor as war reparations. I know for a fact many of my extended family from Hamlisch were sent on trains to do forced labor in Russia after the war. Decades of political oppression, the denial of human rights, the challenges associated with waiting in bread and fuel ration lines from fiscal and economic mismanagement under the Ceausescu dictatorship brought about further hardships for the Saxons in the second half of the 20th century in Romania. While I saw signs of the history and culture everywhere during our trip, Saxon Transylvania no longer exists today. Romania's Saxon settlements, including many of its most popular cities with Saxon origins, are not inhabited by Saxons. It is sad to acknowledge and reckon with the fact that there are fewer than 12,000 Saxons living in Romania today. The culture, the cities, the rural villages, their way of life, and the influence and the contributions they provided the region and its peoples for centuries are gone, and they're unlikely to return. The Transylvania Saxons migrated out of Romania in two great waves, back to the communities in Germany. The first wave came immediately after World War II, and the second, larger wave, after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union. The Ceausescu dictatorship sold the Saxons to Germany, filling their treasury with visa fees. The Saxons left, migrated for the same reasons all migrants in the area of globalization do: for family reunification, for economic opportunity, for political liberty and rights. Leaving was not an easy decision for the Saxons, even with their difficult history in the region. Every country is a story about its own past. That is what a national identity is. While Transylvania is not a country, it is a vital region for Romania. It is sad to know that the Saxons, so important to the story of the region, its development and peoples, will not play a role in the story of its future.
Syl talked a little bit about the Torta Gorge and the mysterious vortex, special feeling that is there. And I also had a similar experience while there. Torta Gorge, Transylvania, Romania, 2021. They have called us brave. The first Americans they have seen since COVID. Brave, perhaps? I'm not so sure. We enter down into the Torta Gorge. I sit down on a rock by a flowing stream, gathering peace. A sudden storm crops up, bending the nearby trees in half. When we leave hurriedly, rain trickling down my back to climb the slippery rocks, I remember it is perfectly acceptable to be brave and scared at the same time. I find myself loudly humming Spirit of Life repeatedly as we find our way out of the gorge. This leads me into another story that I received from Barbara Howell from the early travels to Romania in 1999. Roots hold me close, wings set me free. Now as then, the line from Spirit of Life sings in my heart as I remember Baygon and Budapest. Time spent with members of our partner churches and fulfilling activities grounded us and sent us flying. In the middle of often difficult and tumultuous times in our lives for my daughter Emily and I, we decided to take a gap year before she started university. We chose 3 foreign destinations to connect us with our rich past experiences while preparing us for the future in academic, relationship, and spiritual ways. We were in need of that connection. So we first went to Paraguay to reconnect with Emily's AFS friends and launch my new career, one I never intended to have, as a foreign professor. To facilitate that new opportunity, we both went to London and then returned to Cleveland after our EFL training. Our certificate in hand, deciding what was going to be our next step. Turns out that West Shore and our 2 partner churches at that time had just the right plan. After meeting Bela from Baygon, having a coffee planning session with the other minister, Joseph, they went off to discover our roots and to fly into our futures. Over coffee, we flew into Budapest for 3 weeks and talked about staying there at the church apartment and using our new certificates to volunteer to teach English as a second language at Joseph's church. In addition to seeing the beautiful city, we met lots of people who would open both our eyes and doors. As expected, we regularly spent time with the students, teaching the language and learning about their culture. Plus, they always brought home-cooked Hungarian food to class. See a common theme here? It amazed me how quickly we became comfortable with these new people and the visiting ministers who also stayed in the church's apartment, where long evenings were spent in the courtyard discussing what religion and the Unitarians and the Unitarian Universalists' faiths actually meant. Of course, there were more questions than answers, so that isn't just an American thing. Through Joseph and one of these visiting ministers, we found out about the European UU Virtual Church, whose members were from various countries, were passing through Budapest and on their way to, among other places, Baygon. We joined with them, rode on their bus, and visited the Church of Franz Joseph and other historical sites. Once again, en route, the late-night conversations promoted an even broader base of viewpoints, and yes, a whole lot more questions. Oh, and late-night dance parties and games. It was a little like a long-running family Christmas party if your family was multinational and multilingual. We both had an amazing time, learned how far-reaching this camaraderie was, and that faith could be. The bus rolled into Baygon after a very long ride. Obviously, everyone knew we were coming, and we quickly met dozens of people, from infants to aged, filled with rich wood and tapestries in the sanctuary. Emily and I felt the need to be hushed, but we were the only ones. The excitement was palatable. Few people in the village spoke English, but as we've talked about, speaking was unnecessary. We learned then about the school-supported program that West Shore funded, and in fact, a few of the high school students headed off to their institutions, hopped on the bus, and grabbed a ride. We had been lucky enough to meet a young woman in Baygon who was also there visiting from a Unitarian church further north, where she had recently became a minister. We got to spend the day with her and a few of her congregants. So this was indeed a walk and oftentimes lots of rides of faith. Most of what we did on our month-long trip to Budapest and Baygon was unplanned, spur-of-the-moment, spontaneous. Emily and I built a newfound trust in God's imagination, which has since carried us to places both difficult and challenging. And they've all worked out. We discovered a faith full of people from all over the world who thought it was perfectly okay to ask questions. In fact, it was virtually required for growth. And we learned about people, connected, having fun, meaningless moments with others with whom we did not share a language, but with whom we shared a common understanding of the world, a faith that was built on companionship and trust, because you don't have to speak alike to love alike. Okay, so the next story I want to share is a special one to me. I went on this trip only knowing of my host's family days before I left. with the reassurance from Sil that it would just be fine. Don't worry about it. It'll be fine. And it was more than fine. Here's the message I got a couple days ago from Annika and Zoli. Zoli was the little boy who he and his brother Barney came over here and spent time. And this has been a part of his life. And his new wife of a few years, Zoli, were my host families. She says, just a few months after the birth of our second child, we decided to host a member of the partner church from Cleveland. I was very happy to be a part of this. I was craving something new, something different. And when we met, we instantly became friends. And Barbara became friends with our daughter, too. It didn't matter that they didn't speak the same language. They just knew how to smile at each other. And she even taught me a bit of Hungarian. Then both of my children got sick. I had help from my family who was there, but still it was very powerful to know that I did not have to play the role of host. I was there with all my baggage. May it include cough and runny noses and fever. We were together in this, and I didn't have to hide my pain, my concern for my children. I felt like I was part of a team already. When my daughter could not go to summer camp and could not have her face painted, Sil came to us and did it at home. We weren't left out at all, at any time. Our guest openness amazed me, and I now understand why my husband loved his trip to the U.S. and why, after 12 years, he still talks about that journey often. I now see how powerful of a team you have there at West Shore. Please keep that spirit, and please bring it to us often. And thank you for not having me eat my birthday cake on my 30th birthday alone. So as you can see from the pictures, the bonding between myself and this wonderful family is one that I really will treasure forever. So birthday cakes seem to be a common tradition. And in the next story that Megan's going to share came from Mary Jo Maish.
Mary Jo and I were roommates at Alushka and Barney's home, and she decided to share her story in the form of a letter to me. It says, "Dear Megan, over 3 years ago, we arrived in Transylvania for a pilgrimage, a departure from everyday life to explore our UU past, to immerse ourselves in a beloved community of a small agrarian village, and open ourselves to the mysteries about to unfold. She who would valiant be 'gainst all disaster, let her in her constancy follow the love and light. There's no discouragement shall make her once relent, her first avowed intent to be a pilgrim." Those are Mary Jo's feminization of Bunyan's Pilgrim Hymn lyrics. She writes, "On July 20th, 2018, I celebrated my 70th birthday with all the pilgrims and villagers. In the picture you took, I see the enormous torte made, which reminds me of the room bursting into happy birthday in Hungarian. The music, the community, the pilgrimage access the moment of the greatest spiritual awareness I have ever had. There were all the people who had ever sung to me, a merging of time past and present, and a sense of love. Words have always seemed inadequate to capture exactly how I felt. I feel forever changed since that day. I have deepened my personal spiritual practices, broadened my study of the spiritual roots of my social justice journey, and continued to avow my intent to be a pilgrim. Sincerely, your roommate, Mary Jo." And what Mary Jo doesn't quite share there is that we had a community meal at the community house next to Alushka's. And this happens, I think, every time a big group goes, where the men all cook meats on the grill and the women all make the side dishes. And during that, when everyone sang happy birthday to her, Mary Jo was so overcome with emotion that she had to step out. And she right away needed to talk to her wife, Marcia. But she couldn't speak through the tears. So she dialed the number and handed me the phone, and we went outside. And I spoke to Marcia, and I said, Marcia, Mary Jo's okay. She's okay, but she's really overcome, and she needs to talk to you. So if you can't understand her, just know she's all right. She's just feeling all of the emotions. And it was witnessing that experience with her was truly spiritual for me. Just to see her go through that deep connection of people across language, across all of those miles, and how deeply she was touched by how we were welcomed into the community. And for those of you who have met Alushka, her thoughts on the cake were, it's a little dry.
The next stories are from Jerry Nazel and David Prock from the many trips. They share the common threads of weaving together their personal and spiritual experiences in the partner village. From Jerry. My first trip was in 2006, a year after my life mates, David Prock and Mark Holloway, first went. I grew up on a farm in west central Ohio, so I was anxious to see the farming community in Transylvania. In America, all the farms I know about had a house, a barn, and a few other buildings, surrounded by wide open fields. In Baygon, I found a farm village. Almost every house had a barn right behind the house, surrounded by a fence to hold in the livestock. And right next to it would be another fenced-in farm. The fields for raising crops and pastures for grazing animals were out of town, so the animals, like the cows, would be herded out to pasture in the morning after they were milked and brought back to the barn for the evening milking. What an exciting difference to see from America, and to see much of the farm work done with horse-drawn wagons and machinery intermixed with some modern gas machinery. The most exciting difference was to live among the people of the village with their warm hospitality. Most of the adults didn't speak English, and most of us didn't know Hungarian. But in this year, many of the children were learning English in school and were happy to practice their English and to act as our interpreters. My first year, I stayed with a family who didn't speak English, but through gestures and a Hungarian English dictionary, we did fine. And then their cousin, who had migrated to New York City, came to stay across the road for a week and came over to translate. Each of these trips since then have brought the joy of being a part of the wonderful Baygon community. David Prock's story. I have traveled to several countries. However, on my several journeys to Transylvania engaged my imagination in a fundamentally different way. I would be visiting an exotic land of many tales and myths and mysteries as a participant in a West Shore program. I traveled with Syl and Gary and Dorothy, one of my life mates, Mark Holloway. The images that are emblazoned in my mind are of the warmth and hospitality of the people of the village. The Sunday morning worship service at the Unitarian Church resonated with my Slovak childhood experience in the Slovak Lutheran Church. As a child, I had to go to the 9 o'clock Slovak worship, the 10 o'clock Sunday school, and the 11 o'clock English service. I didn't understand any of the Slovak service, and I did not understand the Hungarian service in Baygon. But the seating arrangement echoed my childhood worship experience. In my childhood church, the men sat on the one side and the women the other, and the children up in the nave. This was the exact seating arrangement at the Baygon Church. The Eastern European culture flavor resonated with my childhood experience. The dancing, the festivals, and instruments, costumes were colorful and reminded me of my Eastern European heritage. So the following pictures were sent to me by Pam and Tom Smith on their journey. And they said, Tom and I have just had a great time reviewing all our pictures from our trip. We love all of the pictures. The first one is of a dirt road, an old woman, and the church. It's just one of their favorite pictures. This one is Bela telling everybody about Unitarian theology in their catechism. And she says it was a mind-blowing, a lightning bolt explanation of Unitarianism. After the crucifixion, there was no tales of Christ's reappearance, just his disciples went out to preach his message. The symbols of the pagan symbols on the church were so inclusive of the 100 years. They're laughing with their host family over the computer translation of some of Tom's jokes into Hungarian. It was so much fun. It was a spiritual bonding experience, to be sure. So all of our experiences, and so many more, we could probably be here all night telling stories. So I hope this has given you some insight into the importance of building a bond with a partner church. In the months to come, you'll be hearing a lot about the exciting trip that Sil was talking about that we planned for next summer to celebrate the restoration of the church, in which our hope is to take the members of the choir and many others. The trip will take place the end of June, beginning of July. We'll know more in January, the exact dates. And she asked me to remind you that if you have any interest and want to hear more stories and share some of the goodies we bring to each meeting. So thank you all for coming tonight. Watch the e-news and the Shorelines for further Thursday at West Shore programs. Hopefully we'll be ramping up for a very busy year. So in closing, when I do closing words, I like to just kind of open the book and find something. And here's what I found for today. It's called Autumn. You can't put the seed back after the pod has burst. A featherweight traveler, the seed knows how to fly. On the edge of this little woods, I have seen the milkweed travel, the one at the bend in the path, appearing across the ravine after the snows have gone. It might have been called a miracle, the plant that walks, but for the rites of fall, like holy days, returning every year, to revel this mystery, pods splitting open and the shiny silken seeds glistening in the sunlit air, taking flight into the wind and doing exactly what they were meant to do. Seeds know how to fly, and plants travel despite their roots. Miracles happen all the time. When we have learned this, there will be no turning back, the journey having just begun.
We've really been struck by the generosity of the people here in Baygon. They've been very friendly and very giving and become really close to us. It's been a wonderful week.
Here we are in Baygon, or Badini in Romania. This is our farewell. We're leaving in a few minutes, and these are the good people who have hosted us and been our friends.
Hello, I am László Pop, the minister of your partner church here in Baygon, Transylvania. We were very happy to receive the gifts which you sent to us. Please accept from us this banner, which has your symbol of a flaming chalice and our symbol of a dove encircled by a snake, which means to be as serpents and innocent as doves.
I hope that you'll all get a chance to visit here sometime because it's been just a wonderful experience.